Well, today we get to look at Romans 8:28, and a very much well-beloved verse for believers through the centuries. Paul states, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." Now, it's very important as we think of Romans 8:28 that we don't assimilate somewhat carelessly into this understanding the general sentiment in the world that you hear quite often, that again, unbelievers will say to people, just hang in there. I know things are bad, but things are going to work out in the end. Just wait and see. Just be confident, and it's going to happen for you. Again, we hear this a lot, but that just kind of general sentiment, maybe somehow a faith in fate or something like that, is not fitting with Romans 8:28. So Romans 8:28 has a great promise. All things work together for good. And then we have two descriptions of believers here. So first of all, let's look at these two descriptions of believers. The first one being, Paul says, we know that for those who love God. Again, this is somewhat unusual for the Apostle Paul because when talking about love, he usually talks about that in terms of God loving us and how great this love is. Very rarely does he talk about our love for God. And we have to be careful here because we could put a lot of pressure on ourselves thinking, okay, if I don't love God so much, a certain degree or in a consistent way, this promise is not going to be good for me. So I better make sure I do my part. What Paul is doing here, he's just kind of giving an objective qualification, not a subjective one. For those who are believers, they can be described as those who love God. So we're believers in Jesus, or we can say it another way and say, we're people who love God. We may not do it perfectly. We may not love God with all of our hearts the way we ought to, but now the direction, orientation of our hearts has changed. We do have a love for God. The second description is those who are called according to his purpose. And this really helps us understand this love we have for God, because it really is God's prior purpose for us that helps to understand how God has put love in our hearts for God. And so 1 John 4:19, Apostle John talks about how we didn't love God first. We hated God, but God loved us first. And so he's called us to salvation, and this salvation is something that is going to be accomplished in our lives because this calling is effective. So God's calling is for the sake of his purpose. And what is his purpose? Well, it says here, for good. Now, it's kind of important to look before this in verse 27 and after this to kind of understand what this is. So verse 27 talks about the Holy Spirit interceding for the saints according to the will of God. Now, we could look at all different scriptures to kind of understand what that will is, but we kind of work the passage here. Verse 28, again, we have this good. So we're going to say, okay, will of God, good. What are we still talking about? Keep going, verse 29, Paul writes, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers." So here we go. Will of God, verse 27, verse 28, good. Verse 29, we have this elaboration, what we're all talking about here, and that is the image of Christ being formed in us. And how will that happen? Well, it's by God's promise, which is that all things work together for this good, the will of God, which is for us to be conformed to the image of his Son. It is God's providential power and his wisdom that ensures that this good, the image of Christ, be formed in us. All things. We go back to verse 18, where Paul says, "For I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is revealed to us." So all things, Romans 8:28, would include verse 18, the sufferings of this present time. And we could also say this probably includes even the sins we've committed in our lives, all mistakes, all failures toward God. God somehow, in his merciful power and wisdom, can even bring good out of those. And that's amazing. And this, of course, would include all the good things are going to work together for good. This is God's covenant promises and blessings. And so what we're trying to say here is this really truly is comprehensive. And we see that God only has good planned for us. There is no evil in his intention and purposes. There are no mistakes. And really only God understands this great good of us being conformed to the image of his Son. But the Father's planned this, the Spirit is interceding for this good, and they're working together to reform us in the image of Christ. And so indeed this is comprehensive. Where you were born, all your growing up, and your parents, your bad decisions, all the blessings and opportunities you've had in your life, the hurts, the conflict, the successes. Notice I've tried to blend together the bad things and the good things, all of it. And the mixture of it all together, somehow God is able to take all those things and redirect it for good, no matter from what source it comes from, so that the good is accomplished. The glory of Christ is made evident in his people. This indeed is not a casual thing, a flippant thing at all. Sure, all things are going to work out together for good. No, this verse is giving us a great confidence in God's purpose in us through Christ. Be encouraged, believer. God indeed is for us and working all things together for our good.